hit record before I forget. Yeah, so how's everybody doing as we wrap up week 4 and approach the midterm?
Excited for the mask thing to end. That's freaking annoying.
You're what? You're excited for what?
The whole drama, the whole political saga, the intense, government reach into our lives with all the, the nasties.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm I'm not all that optimistic. There are these very virulent strains, new strains of this virus extending themselves around the world. I don't know. I, for one, maybe this is my native kind of nihilism coming out, but I'm not at this point seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, as it were. But I don't know. In any case, we still have to go on and do things and live our lives. So here we are. Yeah, so this week we're wrapping up our conversation about Hume, his kind of empiricist-based denial of the self, or his notion of self or personal identity is ultimately illusory. And we have some presenters here who are going to talk with us about Thich Nhat Hanh and the Heart of Wisdom Sutra. So hopefully you guys are prepared for that. Are there any questions or issues about that from our presenters? So Abraham, Mozu, and who was the third? I can't remember. Sorry.
It was me.
Oh, Robin. Okay. Yeah, right. Okay, great. Excellent. So were you guys intending to speak at all about Hume, or were you going to focus entirely on the Buddhist texts?
I was going to start with a little bit about Hume to segue into their texts, but it's mostly just summary.
Okay. Is that true for the others?
I was gonna focus on the Heart of Wisdom, and I believe Robin was gonna do the other reading.
Okay, cool. All right, great. So then the plan is we'll pick up where we left off on the Hume conversation, and then at a certain point, fairly soon in that way, I want to put you guys into breakout rooms to give you the opportunity to talk with each other about a particular question that's a little bit different than the prompts that I have for the discussion forum for this week, although you guys are free to talk about that as well in the breakout rooms. And then we'll see where we are, possibly take a break, and then we'll transition to the presenters. And so just looking ahead to next week, week 5, so the midterm paper is due next Sunday, so a week from this Sunday. And next week we'll be talking about Hegel primarily. So the great 19th century German idealist Hegel, widely considered one of the most important philosophers in history, certainly very influential on social, political, ethical, and to some extent logical developments in the 20th century. And these contributions still resonate with us today. But Hegel is incredibly difficult. As I mentioned in the description of Hegel to prepare you for the reading, and I'm not asking you to read Hegel because that would be cruel of me, but Hegel notoriously said on his deathbed, only one man understood me, and he didn't understand me. And so we can make of that what we will, but we're not reading Hegel directly. We're going to come to his views and ideas specifically with respect to a relational conception of personal identity and selfhood through a chapter of John Russin's recent book from 2015, called Infinite Phenomenology. And Russin is a Canadian philosopher, a contemporary Canadian philosopher. He's a really nice guy. I know him, and he's super smart and a clear, engaging writer. And it's a very interesting reading. It's relatively long, but it's not as difficult as some of the other readings. And then we will supplement that. We'll use a reading of the great Oregonian writer Ursula K. Le Guin, who passed away sadly just a couple years ago. And so she has a great short story called 9 Lives, which takes up some problems that we've grappled with already over the past few weeks in connection to the implications of cloning, of human cloning, and what that means for human identity. But we're really going to use that as a way to talk about self as ultimately relational. And the Thich Nhat Hanh reading for this week, which we'll talk about today, of course, with the presenters, that's kind of in many ways importantly preparing us to turn next week to this relational conception of self. But I think Hegel has a particular philosophical approach, or a kind of social ontology, really, ontology being the philosophy of being or existence, that fills in some deficiencies that I find in some ways glaring in Thich Nhat Hanh's interpretation of the sutra. And so just looking at next week, and I mentioned this before, there is no quiz and there is no discussion forum. So there's just the midterm paper, but also the annotation assignment, the engaged reading assignment for both the Russin essay and the Ursula K. Le Guin short story. So you still have that on the table, but a little bit less work. Okay. Also, so I don't know if any of you participated last night. I didn't myself advertise for this event, but is anyone familiar with Campus Theme, the Campus Theme program at SOU? And did anyone participate in the shit show that was the first Campus Theme event last night? I think I was rather prescient in my decision to not advertise it to anyone because it was fairly disastrous. There are all kinds of annoying Zoom issues.
Oh, Zoom? You gotta be kidding me. That's a joke.
Yeah, so I'm the co-chair actually of the Campus Theme program, and I couldn't do anything in Zoom. Nobody could see me. I had to get permission from my co-chair to talk, and only my co-chair. So my colleague in philosophy, Prakash Chinjeri, his face was the only face you could see for the whole session, yet he wasn't talking. So you just heard these disembodied voices with him nodding periodically. But Campus Theme is a program that the SOU has had for 12 years, so I'm the co-chair of it now. But the idea is every year a particular theme or concept or idea is selected, and it's used as a kind of intellectual centerpiece around which the intellectual community of the university and also some guests from outside this particular region can kind of bring different perspectives to illuminate. And so for the past 2 years now, as it's appropriate, the theme has been uncertainty. And we picked that theme for not this year directly that's underway, but for the previous year that saw the beginning of the pandemic. So that was rather, I don't want to call it, well, it was just a strange coincidence pretty much. But now, so we've just decided to extend that. So we've basically been dealing with the theme of uncertainty for the past year and a half. And because of the pandemic lockdown and confusion surrounding that, we didn't have any events for the fall, but we have events now for the winter and spring on schedule. And so the first one was last night, and it was a panel discussion organized by the USEM faculty. And they were sort of talking about their own experience of uncertainty over the past year and a half or so. But I'm excited to announce a couple other events, which hopefully won't have those horrific technical difficulties. So the next Campus Theme event is, and I'll talk about this again, I'll send out a poster when it's made, but the next Campus Theme event is scheduled for February 10th. So that's a Wednesday, not this next Wednesday, but the following. So in about 2 weeks or so. And it's 7 p.m. And I invited the philosopher Graham Harman, no relation, and the last name has a different spelling. It's Harman. But he is a distinguished professor of philosophy at the Southern California Institute of Architecture in Los Angeles. He's the author of some 18 books, and he's widely considered among the most influential living philosophers in the world. And he's going to give us a very interesting discussion on what he calls justified untrue belief. And so, yeah, I'll have like a little blurb, a little description of his presentation to provide for you soon. And then 2 weeks after that, so February 25th, and this is relevant for today's assignments, for today's reading materials, I managed to get the bishop of the Nichiren order of Buddhism for all of North America. And she's going to talk with us about the relationship of the Buddhist tradition, very broadly construed because there is no monolithic Buddhist tradition, but various perspectives from within that historical and intellectual tradition on uncertainty. And also she'll be accompanied by a very good old friend of mine who's a practicing Zen Buddhist who is now a volunteer monk with the Compassionate Service Society in Anaheim, California. So I think that'll be a really good informal kind of just a nice informal friendly dialogue in a couple weeks. So I'll mention those things again, and I'll offer some extra credit for those who care to join us and participate in at least one of those two events. So I won't give you, double extra credit, but you can, I hope that you come to both, but I'll give you some extra credit, a couple points added to your overall final grade if you elect to join us. But it should be really interesting and stimulating, I'm thinking. So are there any questions about that or anything else before we get back into it?
Will you have those posted on the Moodle or send us an email so I can put them in my calendar?
I'll send out an announcement with the relevant details, and there will be posters, and there will be like a Zoom link. And the problem I think with last night is we set it up, or I won't say we, I had nothing to do with it. I will remove myself from all culpability. But the problem was it was set up as a webinar. And so there were these two mysterious Zoom links, one for panelists and one for attendees. And if you use the attendee link, you were basically invisible. You couldn't see anybody except for Prakash Chenjeri, and you couldn't see any of the chat. You couldn't say anything. And the only people who had the panelist link were my colleague Prakash and one other person from USEM. Yet they, for some reason, weren't able to share that link with anybody else. So I'm going to try to make it so it's just a normal Zoom session without the weird webinar confusion. So hopefully it'll be fine next time. But yeah, those details will be forthcoming. And I am catching up. I mentioned I'm behind because of some distractions in my own life. I got behind on attending to the discussion forums, but I have responded to a number of your annotations from the readings from the past week, and so I am catching up, and I'll catch up fully over the weekend. All right, so any other questions or anything? All right, cool. So let us, like I said, let's jump back into our discussion of Hume, and then I will create some breakout rooms. Okay, let me pull this back up. All right, so here's where we left off last time, but maybe we should backtrack just a little bit and return to Hume's so-called bundle theory. So this is, again, on page 133. So he says, the mind is a, let's see. Setting aside metaphysicians of this kind, I'm willing to affirm that the rest of mankind, that each of us is nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions that follow each other enormously quickly and are in a perpetual flux and movement. Our eyes can't turn in their sockets without varying our perceptions. And perception is an outward impression, right? So every time I blink, every time I move my eye in one direction or another, I am constructing and participating in a new impression. And he doesn't just use this language to characterize our own sensuous or perceptual experience in the world. That is from our subjective perceptual origin. He talks about the qualitative dimensions of various experiential phenomena out in the world in comparable terms. So for instance, if you hear like a long horn or something, or like a siren, right? Or if you hear trickle of water, if you're hiking or something, and there is like a waterfall near you, or the rustling of leaves or whatever. If there is some more or less continuous sound, we tend to, without thinking about it, ascribe or attribute a unity to that sound in its unfolding, in its various coming to presence for our experience, for our perception, our awareness. But Hume says the sameness there is of a purely qualitative, that is analogical or comparative nature. So if you hear someone angrily beating on their horn, right, you'll say that's the same sound. But those are, strictly speaking, in every instance, a different sound that our mind tends to subjectively project outward a kind of sameness or identity or unity to. And so to go on, so now we're connecting this bundle theory to the theater metaphor. He says the mind is a kind of stage on which many perceptions successfully make their appearance. They pass back and forth, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of positions and situations. Strictly speaking, there is no simplicity in the mind at one time, and no identity through different times. So simplicity and identity are those fundamental attributes that philosophers like Descartes have tended to ascribe to the self. And so those are the attributes that Hume is precisely rejecting. No matter what natural inclination we may have to say that simplicity and identity, or to imagine, excuse me, that simplicity and identity. And then, so this is sort of what I was referencing just a moment ago about experientially continuous sensuous phenomena like sounds or images or smells or whatever. He says, that is to say, it is not strictly true that when a blue color is seen and a whistling sound heard at the same time, one unified mind has both of these perceptions. So there is the quale or qualitative character of the blue, and then there is the quale or qualitative character of the whistling sound, and maybe they're connected in the same object, and we attribute some sort of causal origin to that unity and to the emergence of these phenomena in our experience. But Hume's whole point here is that is a kind of trick to which we are disposed by the nature of our very constitution as human beings. That is a kind of illusory tendency to which the human mind is drawn, whether it likes it or not, whether it is consciously aware, as Hume seems to be, of this tendency or not. But then he goes on to say, the stage comparison must not lead us, because you might think, okay, then the self isn't, so imagining the stage as in a theater where you can attend a dramatic performance, for example. Well, what do we find brought about over the course of this platform or stage? We find characters living lives, performing actions. We see props, which are placed or removed or replaced or removed as the stages of the play unfold. And so these are what, metaphorically? These are, how do we connect that if we're using this analogy to our own experience in the world as selves? So what are these characters that move across the stage? What are these props? What are these actions?
Are they thoughts?
Good, yeah. So thoughts, right? So, and a thought is an idea, remember? And an idea is necessarily grounded in and thus presupposes a prior impression, so some kind of sensory experience. So there's this essential relationship, a kind of unilateral causal relationship between perceptions or impressions and ideas or thoughts. But it's not just thoughts. I mean, it could just be the impressions that I have. So looking out my window right now, I see a particular scene that I can describe in terms of the tree branches, the leaves gently moving in the breeze. There is an arrangement or pattern of clouds. There is a bird staring at me on one of the branches. I turn my head back to the screen. Maybe 30 seconds later, I look, the bird is gone, the clouds have altered, and so forth. So even we can talk about the metaphor of the theater and the objects that are brought across the stage in various relationships in terms of our perceptions too. But yeah, thoughts as well. So like if you're similar to me, you're lying in bed at night trying to go to bed, and you are plagued by all these insistent thoughts that keep you awake, but they don't necessarily remain. They point to another thought, which points to another, and you are, without necessarily even understanding what's befalling you, brought along this kind of chain. And so I think that that's how we can characterize or bring into connection what's happening on the stage in this particular thought experiment. And so then you might think, if all that is changing, well, what remains the same? So if you're an audience member sitting in the theater watching a performance, and through the multiple acts, everything changes in terms of the content. What is the same? What remains unchanged?
The stage.
Right, the stage. So he says the mind is a kind of stage. But then what does he do right after laying out the terms of this analogy? He says, so because you might think, well, then the unity we're after, in fact, the simplicity we're after, because you can imagine a stage after a performance is concluded and the stage hands remove all of the props. There is no longer any present feature, any object or attribute that you can look at that would connect you to the performance that had concluded, or perhaps prepare you for the performance to come. It's just simple, the simple stage. And in its simplicity, it is unified in its self-identity, right? So then you might be brought to think along Hume's own trajectory of thought here, that we then, in our identity and simplicity, the very ego, the very self or I is the stage. But then Hume snatches that interpretation away, right? He says, the stage comparison must not mislead us. What constitutes the mind is just the successive perceptions. We haven't the faintest conception of the place where these scenes are represented or of the materials of which it is composed. So the stage analogy then is this kind of imperfect crutch to allow us to at least approximate the insight he's after, but we can't rely on it too much because it's misleading. There is no stage, right? There are only the events. There is no stage in the background. That's what he means when he says we haven't the faintest conception of the place, because unlike the stage, we can't simply remove all of our thoughts, all of our perceptions, all of our emotional feelings, so those inward impressions. We can't do that and perhaps in this artificial way reduce us to the status of Avicenna's floating man. And that's what we've talked about before. Anytime I try to attune myself to myself, this personal identity, which remains continuous and enduring as itself, despite changes, all I find are the varying characteristics, qualities of experience, dimensions of thought, directions of questioning or whatever else that make up my consciousness, my conscious experience as being in the world. I can't remove all of that to get to some naked, bare self that is an unqualified self. It's always qualified in one way or another. Okay, so does that make sense where he's coming from here?
What about meditation? Because like that's an act of clearing all of the mind. So wouldn't that be just sitting in the empty stage or sitting with the empty stage?
Maybe, and I'm glad you brought that up because I'm going to lead us through a guided meditation today. Because, and this is obviously in connection to the notion of shunyata that we'll be engaged with in the context of the so-called Heart of Wisdom Sutra and Buddhism more broadly. The practice of meditation lies at the heart of that tradition. But I want to talk about it as a way of perhaps criticizing Hume's theory. And we get this criticism from perhaps surprisingly or improbably, not necessarily a Buddhist orientation or the insight of a Buddhist practitioner, but from an 18th century German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who was pretty far from Buddhism. And he probably didn't engage with Buddhist philosophy at all, unlike Hume. But I think that we can connect Kant's so-called transcendental philosophy to the practice of meditation and to certain insights that we find in Buddhism. So it's a way to kind of bridge the gap between the so-called Eastern and Western philosophical traditions. So yeah, Cheyenne, I'm really glad you brought that up. But does anyone, so just to build on that, I mean, so Cheyenne, do you meditate at all, or does anyone else have experience with one version of meditation or one strategy of meditation or another?
Yeah, I practice pretty regularly.
Oh, okay, good. So what would you say in response to Cheyenne? Is that a good, perhaps beginning of a criticism of Hume's move here in his argument, or what do you think?
Possibly. I do like the idea of like calling it like just sitting on the stage and watching it.
Mhm.
Because well, if within the analogy you're talking about our consciousness as a stage, it's almost like we can tend to become a character ourselves whenever we're interacting with the other characters, which are our sensations.
Hmm.
And if you don't take some time to actually just sit back and watch the stage, whenever you do that, you can start to see a lot more detail in all of the characters, and it can really help you like navigate the play a lot better. But yeah, I do think that's a very relevant analogy.
Yeah, I really love what you just said there. So when you, so there's this possibility of taking a step back, as it were, and maybe loosening your gaze and fixation on any particular object or event that takes place on the stage. And it doesn't necessarily mean you're focused on the stage, because that would just be the same thing. Instead of focusing on this guy on the stage or this woman or this particular prop, you're just focused on the stage. Well, that's not exactly getting at it, but this loosening up of your vision or your gaze or your consciousness, it's not exactly a pure emptiness or nothingness, but it's a kind of indeterminacy where you can now, and I think this is what you are getting at very helpfully, Abraham, you can now see the various objects with whom you established some kind of relationship. If you were observing them or thinking about them, you now see various relationships that stand between them, subtle or perhaps significant or dramatic, that were previously kind of obscured in virtue of that obsession, if you can put it that way, or perhaps just fixation on particular abstract elements of the whole scene. But it's not exactly, again, a fixation on the whole scene, because then that's reducing the whole, again, to a snapshot or a kind of isolated object. But good. So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. But there is the struggle though of meditation. And so is anyone familiar with transcendental meditation? So that really comes from that's so that's
I
not
was raised
exactly
with
Buddhist, but yeah, go ahead.
Oh, so sorry. I was raised with a Buddhist father, and there's this like idea. I can't really explain it because he knows more about the religious, or the theological origins of it. But there's this idea of just being,
Mhm.
and that's kind of what I was more. I love how Abraham put that though about
Yeah.
how meditation's kind of trying to reposition yourself. But then what I was kind of getting at is there is a way to kind of separate yourself from these thoughts and be, maybe some people struggle more with it. Like you were saying, there is a struggle for some people for meditation and stuff like that.
Mhm.
But I was more saying like, what would that be if what's that presence of just being? Is that an empty stage, or like you're saying, is it a stage that's has things on it, but it's more your perspective?
Good. Yeah. So what about just being? Right? I think that's what um, the kind of Zen trajectory of Buddhist thought is oriented around. And there is a timelessness, but a timelessness that doesn't really point to the expansion of eternity so much as the sharp immediacy of the moment, of the now, right? So you can implement this kind of Zen approach to the Buddhist practice of meditation in your everyday waking life. And so in that regard, Zen arose in the kind of development of this tradition as a critical reaction to what some have observed, and some even within the context of Buddhism itself, as a kind of quietism, or a sort of problematic passivity, or a removal of oneself from the world. And this is actually how Nietzsche came, so the 19th century German philosopher, he was critical of what he called passive nihilism in Buddhism. And perhaps there's some of that can be found in the Heart Sutra, right? But the Zen movement saw that and took the criticism seriously and said, no, we don't want to just be, I mean, when you're meditating, if you're just like lying on your back, your bones are just there while you're alive, and then you die and your bones are still there. Like there's the necessity of being in the world, of engaging in the world.
If I could
Oh yeah,
interrupt,
go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, what exactly was Nietzsche's criticism regarding that passive nihilism? And I'm assuming by passive nihilism, they mean kind of like in that practice, the acceptance of like misery and suffering in the world.
Yeah, that's a part of it. So that's not exact. In fact, to some extent, Nietzsche would champion the embrace of misery and suffering as a life affirmer, as a yes sayer, to recognize misery and suffering. And unlike utilitarians who want to dissolve all pain in favor of happiness or pleasure, and Nietzsche says that that results in the sort of projected end of history in the figure of the last man, who is so content with everything, just sits there blinking. But passive nihilism in his criticism of Buddhism is the idea that because of the misery and suffering, we should just isolate ourselves into an embrace of the nothing through meditation. So go to the temple and hide from the world, right? Just sit there and meditate. But that criticism doesn't apply to Zen, is what I was suggesting, because the Zen sect takes very seriously the ethical import of engaging in the world and the challenge of reducing, mitigating suffering, not in the utilitarian sort of along the utilitarian plan to create a world of perfect, seamless, uninterrupted pleasure or happiness, but really out of a gesture of universal compassion, right? So does that make sense? That's kind of where his criticism was going, but I think that it's it's ultimately coming from a rather shallow understanding of Buddhism on his part.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. His mentor, whom he later rejected for these or for similar reasons, Arthur Schopenhauer, another 19th century German philosopher after Hume, was the next major philosopher of the Western tradition to engage very seriously with Buddhism. And he appropriated it into his own thought in accordance with a kind of pessimism, right? And that's where Nietzsche comes to reject Schopenhauer as a life denier, as a passive nihilist, along with the other Buddhists. But again, I think that's not a very, it's not a necessarily accurate portrayal or interpretation of Buddhism. Okay, so yeah, so going back to, yeah, there's that struggle in meditation, right? So the point that Cheyenne brought up, there is that struggle, and that's what Buddhists and meditators refer to within the Buddhist tradition as the monkey mind, right? So you try to silence these thoughts or to repress these distractions or whatever, but they'll rear their head or whatever. But different approaches to meditation say, well, the task isn't necessarily to empty your mind, but to notice the inherent emptiness of the objects that come to stand in this sort of continuously changing drama of your mind. So to just observe what goes on in the struggle, right? And not necessarily to expect that you can come to a state of complete non-being. And we'll talk more about that. So I kind of want to jump back to Hume here, but that's very much relevant what we were talking about to connect us to the Buddhist stuff. But any other comments on that? So we'll come back to that shortly.
Can I say something about
Yeah.
meditation a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
That was something that I really struggled with when I first started. I just didn't have like a solid perception of what my goal was with meditation. And so like the way that I kind of looked at it, there's a traffic analogy that I really like, and I feel like a lot of people get mixed up in, is I would go and I'd sit down and I'd like do all my breathing, and then the way that I viewed my thoughts was kind of like traffic going past, but instead of like just kind of watching the traffic go past and noticing, I'd be like, oh, it's like a blue Chevy. I'd like get out in the middle of the road and like try to stop everything, like stop all the traffic and be like, okay, like nothing's happening, like it's great up here. And then that took a while to kind of understand what you were saying about like just kind of sitting and watching and being at peace with like whatever's going on instead of trying to control it.
Good, yeah, good. Right, and so the Zen criticism is, you know, you're never going to remove yourself from the overwhelming and lightning fast mutability of the world, the constantly changing features of the world. In your existence, you can't simply remove yourself from that. So it's a misguided goal from the start to assume that. But we'll talk about the alternative to that because it's confusing. And of course, the Heart Sutra, as all sutras are, they're supposed to be like goads for thought. They're supposed to be these sort of sparks of incitement towards insight itself for thinking. And that incitement towards thinking isn't pointing to a foregone conclusion at which you can finally arrive. Once arriving, articulate it in intellectual or conceptual terms, right? So that's why if you look at like the Zen literature, hundreds of years old in many cases, so the Zen literature is made up of accounts of teachers giving lessons to students and sometimes even physically abusing students. They'll say these very oracular, very mysterious, very strange pronouncements in response to questions that the student asks. And sometimes the student will get it, but you're the reader, you're standing on the outside. And you're like, what the fuck is that supposed to mean? But it's this immediate sort of, it's like a diamond like arrow that just hits you in your head, and it's clear right there for the moment, totally understood. And I think this might be what Cheyenne was getting at, in the sense of being, right? It's just all there right now. And that's really what Zen means. It's this kind of immediacy. And it's not translatable in clear intellectual conceptual terms. And this is, to a large extent, what distinguishes the Eastern philosophical tradition from the Western philosophical tradition.
I saw Abraham put a Ram Dass quote down there, which I really like in the
Oh.
chat. The be here now thing is, yeah.
Yeah, Be Here Now. I have that book. It's really wonderful. It's great. There are lots of cool illustrations in there. Yeah, it's really fun to get lost in the forest of that text. Okay, so, but then the question is, and so moving on, the question is, if identity or selfhood is an illusion, exactly what are the psychological origins of this illusion? How does it come about? Well, we have this tendency, and this is something that we talked about weeks ago in the context of John Perry's dialogue, because remember, Hume was one of those silent voices in the background that the characters were drawing on. So we have this tendency to call something the same, even if it has been changed in an obvious sense or perhaps a subtle way. So you take a tiny piece of perhaps almost imperceptible piece from a rock, and we say, yeah, it's the same rock, but it's really not. And so we talked about this in Locke, how if you understand the identity of a physical object, of a material substance, as ultimately reducible to the scientific standard of mass, then if you remove a tiny piece, you have removed ultimately the identity of the object to which you were related before, and you have two objects which are not identical, but we tend to call it the same. And then when it comes to organism, we say that a mature oak tree is the same as the sapling, or in some sense the same as the acorn. A fat adult, we say they're the same as a tiny infant, out of which they grew in some way. The parts of the river change dramatically, yet we call it the same river. And so I didn't mention this in class, but I think I commented on this in some of your annotations when discussing the John Perry dialogue. But the famous pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, who was appropriated by Disney, I think, in one of the cartoons. Someone mentioned this to me. I'm not a viewer of Disney movies myself, but I can't remember which one. One of the characters said this: you can't step into the same river twice. Well, that comes from the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, and he meant it as a kind of paradox, right? Because on the one hand, obviously you can step into the same river. So you can go down to the Rogue River on a Tuesday, put your foot in it, return to it on Thursday, put your foot in it, and say, what do you say now, Heraclitus? But on the other hand, you can't. Why? Because the water has changed. But he also recognizes that you have changed when you put your foot back in it. Yet Hume is saying here that we tend to call it the same river, despite the fact that the water that makes up that river is never identical. And so philosophers like Descartes have attempted to get around this issue through positing the positing of a particular kind of substance or object, which they call the immaterial soul. And I mentioned this before, Thomas Hobbes, so way before Hume, said the very idea of an immaterial substance is a contradiction. So back in the 17th century, he was critical of this kind of metaphysical argument from Descartes. But we've already examined the problems with that, positing as a condition for identity, which has to be observed, something which can't in itself be observed. And so, and then what does Locke do? Remember, Locke says, well, identity is memory. And that's somewhat counterintuitive because we tend to think I exist as a human subject, as a human mind. And because I exist as a human subject, I have memories. But Locke says, no, because you have memories, it's that you exist. as a unified thing that we call a self, or we make sense of in terms of a mind or something like that. And this is a problem, according to Hume. He says that, first of all, Locke is confusing the means by which we infer in an illusory way, a deceptive way, identity with identity itself. He says if we didn't have memories, then we would never come to think that there is some self. So has anyone seen the film, the Christopher Nolan film, Memento, from like the late 90s? Christopher Nolan directed Inception, and then recently Tenet, which I haven't seen yet. But Memento is about a guy who, through some traumatic event, loses his short-term memory entirely. So he has no idea what's going on, really, from one moment to the next. And he's pursuing some mystery to find out who did this to him, and I think who killed his wife, maybe. It's been a long time since I've seen it. But he has to constantly tattoo, basically post-it note messages all over himself to remind him of what's going on. And one issue that the character grapples with throughout is he has no real stable sense of himself, of who he is. He has to constantly look at these tattoos to capture himself from one moment to the next. And then Hume points out that if Locke is right, and we've already examined this criticism, well, then that means you can't be the same person you were, say, 15 years ago if you forget who you were at that time, which seems to be a problem that Locke had to embrace. It was a bullet, so to speak, he had to bite. But Hume thinks that nobody else is really willing to do that. Nobody, through a kind of common sense reflection, would say, oh yeah, I guess that's not me, that wasn't me. And so that's sort of the criticism that Hume takes there. And so this is the ship of Theseus paradox that he brings up, specifically in the context of the Hume reading in connection to, this story of a church, right, that is destroyed for whatever reason, but then the congregation builds it back, brick by brick, perhaps in a way that perfectly resembles the previous structure, or maybe not. Maybe they decide to take an entirely different architectural approach when rebuilding the destroyed church. Yet, we tend to call it the same church. And so this is one of the kind of psychological sources for how it is that this sort of illusion arises in the course of all of our experience. I wanted to give you guys some time to talk about this together. So the ship of Theseus paradox, and I think it was Daniel who actually brought this up in maybe one of the readings from a couple weeks ago, or maybe it was last week, I don't remember, but this is an ancient thought experiment. So imagine this ship that leaves port and it goes on an epic, perhaps year-long journey, maybe circumnavigating the globe or something. And over the course of this journey, of course, this wooden ship, it tends to get worn down, and the planks that make it up have to periodically be replaced. So over the course of this journey, over the course of maybe a year, eventually every wooden plank, every physical part that makes up the whole of the ship has been replaced. And now the ship of Theseus returns to port. And the question is, do we think it's the same ship? Hume says that, yeah, that's what we tend to do. But then he comes to his own conclusion in accordance with what we've been talking about so far. And so that's where I'll kind of take a break from this and put you guys into some breakout rooms for just a few minutes and give you a chance to talk about this thought experiment. So what do you guys think? Do you think that the ship is the same or not? And however you answer this, what does that have to tell us, or what does that tell us about this philosophical problem of personal identity? So does that make sense, the question? All right, cool. So any questions before I make the breakout rooms? All right, so I'll go ahead and do that now. I'll make 5 rooms, and so there'll be 3 or 4 people in each breakout room. And then I'll give you like 10 minutes or so, something like that, to talk about this, and then I'll let you know when to start wrapping up your conversations. So I'll send you that way now. So again, the question is this ship through the thought experiment, or is the church in Hume's example the same or not? And what does that have to tell us about personal identity? So let me open the rooms, and I'll see you guys in a few minutes. Okay, guys, I think, yeah, we're all here now. So I trust there are some fascinating stuff going on in your breakout rooms. So who wants to share with us? So I should say that while you guys were discussing that, I got a call from my wife, who is at home, and we just had some contractors go over there because there's some water damage in our kitchen. And now I have my own, apparently, ship of Theseus problem. The whole kitchen floor has to be replaced. And I might wonder if it's the same fucking floor, but so that's good news. Yeah, just another thing to add on. So uh, anybody want to share?
Yeah.
That happened. Cool, go ahead, Alec.
So we were kind of talking, and I was thinking that there's kind of 2 answers to the ship question. So physically, it's a totally different object, but physically, it's also not a ship. But conceptually, it's a ship. So the concept of it has stayed the same. It's the same ship, but it's not the same object. Like a ship's not actually a ship until you name it a ship. It's just a bunch of wood.
Mhm.
So, like we use these concepts to give things names. Otherwise, it's just whatever it's made out of. So it's totally different wood, but since you call it the same ship, it's conceptually the same thing.
Cool, yeah. So then there is the object and there is the concept. And what is a concept? Except, and this is what the word suggests, that which encapsulates a number of perhaps disparate aspects of something and gathers it into a meaningful whole. Sorry, Daniel, did you have a choking moment there?
Someone run to Daniel and give him Heimlich.
Yeah, so then where is the, so there's the, so Alec was saying there's the wood or whatever that makes up this physical thing that we label a ship, but then that label is derived from a kind of conceptual origin. And where is the concept?
Like, where does the concept derive from?
Yeah.
Just like a societal agreement on what the parameters for this object's functional name. So somebody had to be like, well, if it floats, it's a ship or a boat, I mean, it's obviously more complicated than that, but just to keep it short. And so everyone said, yeah, all right, if it's floating, it's a boat. And so now you can name something that floats a boat.
So then the concept then by which this particular ship might be recognized as the same entity, you might say, then issues from the subject, right? The mind, the thinking individuals who pass along in various ways this concept by which we societally, as you mentioned, can in different experiences recognize this thing we call a ship and use it. And in this case, we're talking about this particular ship, this ship that has a particular label and is on that basis distinguished from other ships. But then you can also ask, well, what is this ship that we identify as the same from our own perspective, despite the changing material elements? What is this ship to, say, a tiny ant that might have been a stowaway, so to speak, and is crawling along one of those planks? Well, it bears a relationship to this thing that we call and use as a ship, but for the ant, it's not a ship, right? It's something entirely different. It's something entirely other. Yet in some sense, we want to say it's the same object with which we are engaged and that we're relating to, whether we're sailors or whether we're standing on the shore and watching it go by, right? So I think that's a very helpful distinction, depending upon if you begin from the object side, looking at the materiality, or the subject side. And that's what Hume's thought experiment does in connection to the church, right? It's really the memory of the congregants who have been a part of this church their whole lives, and maybe their parents were a part of it and so forth, and passed on their own memories. And so the being of the church, which they all call the same, is preserved conceptually in this memory, despite the changes that take place, even complete annihilation of the thing, physically speaking. But so Hume's response is, well, no, it's obviously not the same fucking church. We're all really stupid. I mean, that's not exactly what he says, but to paraphrase. But yeah, any other thoughts on that?
It just kind of speaks to our fundamental attachment to object permanence. Like we just kind of intrinsically think that way.
Yeah, so even, yeah, permanence. So even if the ship didn't change its planks, I mean, Hume might be inclined to say it's still, I mean, he would be, in fact. That's the radical sort of conclusion of his argument here, that even if this ship of Theseus didn't change its planks progressively over time, it's still not the same object from one moment to the next. But he uses this particular example of the church to point out that even in cases where the thing in question is changed unquestionably, like in really far-reaching extreme ways, we still tend to think of it as the same. So we still assign identity to it. And so how can we maybe use that aspect of his argument to rethink personal identity in our own cases? Like, what is his point there?
To reiterate that we're constantly changing?
Yeah, that we, like that ship, even one, so we can imagine, for instance, especially now in the 21st century, where I can apparently go for no reason other than wanting to be better at basketball, I can have my knees replaced. I can get bionic knees. We could, potentially transform our physical bodies in all sorts of ways and still think we're the same. But Hume is saying even without those radical interventions, we're not the same from one moment to the next, right? So that kind of permanence then has nothing to do with our objective being, our existence in the world. It is the byproduct of subjectivity, of our natural dispositions to think, which Hume argues as an empiricist are grounded in our sensuous experience of the world. So it's because the way we perceive the world as physical bodies, that it's constantly changing and ourselves are constantly changing. Our mind tries to keep up. Our mind tries to catch up with all of it, but is always lagging behind. And to compensate, it tends to smooth over into a unity or continuity, what is really a series of gaping holes, so to speak. Good, so any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think perhaps a logical extension from that is that, like, physically, substantially, things are changed in terms of like their identity whenever something happens to them. Like if an atom leaves, it is like substantially a different thing, but our choice to call it the same thing, just like, I guess, as a consciousness, our choice to say, oh, this is the same mason jar, even if, like, I don't know, it gets a crack or something like that, is kind of what gives it its identity. In our breakout room, we talked about the ship of Theseus and like how different parts can be changed, like replaced when they're repaired. And then we're like, okay, what happens if instead of repairing the ship, we're upgrading it, we're giving it new parts with new functions? Can we still say it's the same ship? Well, maybe if we decide to call it the same ship. Yes, substantially it's not the same thing, but our choice to call it that makes it so that, you know, to us, which is really what is important, it is the same ship. So I think identity can be something that is just in our minds, not necessarily a part of reality, but part of how we perceive reality.
Good, yeah, and if Hume is right, it's an inescapable part of how we perceive reality. We can't just choose to not see it in that way. And so so then we might ask, though, if Hume is right about all this, what does that substantially mean as a matter of concrete significance for our own lives? And we can pose this question too when we talk about, in just a few minutes, when we have our presenters, you know, this Buddhist insight of selfhood as illusory. In other classes, when I've talked about this Buddhist conception of self, many students who are unfamiliar with it, who come from a kind of Christian background or something else entirely, they think, well, my God, if I have no self, well, then I can't do anything. Like, why do anything at all? It doesn't make any sense. Yet there are millions of Buddhists in the world who wake up every day, they go to work, they use technology, they go to the grocery store, they have meaningful relationships with others. And so, I mean, exactly what are we supposed to do with this? What do you guys think about that? I mean, does it mean anything practically if there is no self?
Well, it's about like your perspective. If you put all of your not self-worth, but like your value in like this idea of yourself, and if you're just working to like build up that image of yourself, and you base like your happiness on your accomplishments, your thoughts, your, you know, like various things that you equate with being yourself, you know, if you're very attached to those ideas, then obviously there's going to be some type of resistance between you and fundamentally understanding or trying to wrap your head around that type of an idea. But when you're a little bit more fluid with your experience and with yourself, I think it's just a little bit easier to understand that. Yeah.
Good, yeah, that's a beautiful way you put that, I think. So it's the attachment, right? It's this kind of rigidity and attachment to the objects that one's familiar with as ideas of oneself, of what's important, values, and so forth, that one over time gets really fixated on. And so when such things really start to turn towards disappointment in the course of your life, well, then that can be quite painful and destructive for the stability of your sense of self if you're not equipped with this sort of fluidity, like Thea just put it, this flexibility, right? So yeah, I really like the way you put that. But so I want to give the presenter some time, but let us first look at the critique that I mentioned from the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. So Hume's basic argument, so let me pull this up real quick and share the screen. So Hume's basic argument is every idea that we have necessarily derives from some original sense impression. So anything of which we have an idea has to have come from some sense impression. So the same would be the case for the idea of the self. Yet Hume says, look for this thing, look for an impression of the self. you can't find it, right? There is no one unified, simple impression that you can turn to that gives you identity. So I have an impression of this object or thing which I take to be an object, but it's really a collocation of various properties or qualities. But in any case, I can look at this thing and say, here is a substance and it has on it all these qualities and they can change. So I might take paint and paint it a different color or something. But when you think of the self, there is no object that we refer to when making this kind of thought relation or perceptual relation. I mean, I can see my body, but that body is always qualified in some way. It's now sitting in a chair under certain atmospheric conditions at a certain time of day and so forth. So there's never this unitary thing. But here is Immanuel Kant's tremendous insight here. He, first of all, accepts Hume's conclusion. He says, Hume, you're right. There is no object that we can consistently pin down and refer to when observing or recognizing self or identity, right? There is no object that corresponds to I or self. And so to show where he's going with this, though, he sets up the analogy between I as the self or subject and the I as the physical sense organ that allows you to visually perceive, right? So think about how your eyes work as perceptual organs. So I never see my eyes as a physical object that's available for my perception, except in those relatively exceptional cases where I'm looking in a mirror or some other reflective surface. I never apprehend my eyes in ordinary circumstances of navigating the environment, walking around, doing things as a particular object. Yet, my eyes are nevertheless a condition for the very possibility of perceiving anything out in the world, right? So my eyes are never available as objects, except in those rare instances of looking at a mirror or something. My eyes aren't available as objects for perception. Instead, they are conditions for the very possibility of perception. So Kant says the self or the I is like that. And he calls it the transcendental unity of apperception. So remember, apperception means to perceive that you perceive. So Kant says implicit in every perceptual experience or thought is the attachment of an I or a self, which is significantly, and this is his criticism of Hume, it's not an object. It's a condition for the possibility of experience. So he says, and this is his argument, this is one of a few so-called transcendental arguments from Kant. If there were no unified enduring self of some kind, then experience would be hopelessly chaotic and confused. If everything that we are aware of in terms of ourself were just a discordant, loose bundle of perceptions, well then I wouldn't be able to make sense of my experience at all. It would be inescapably chaotic and confused. But then he says, using the logical move of modus tollens, so that's a formal kind of argument or structure of argument, which is valid. He says experience is not hopelessly chaotic and confused. So we already looked at an example of modus tollens back in the Perry dialogue. So remember, if the argument was, if the sense of identity is based on recognition of a soul, then it would be mysterious how we're able to make identity claims at all. It's not mysterious, therefore it can't be based on the soul. So Kant's making a similar move here. And he concludes, therefore, there must be some unified enduring self, even if it's not a substance or a thing or an object. So the conclusion here is the I or the self is not an object of experience. It's not something that we can come to through an impression. It's a necessary condition for the very possibility of experience or the very possibility of having impressions or perceptions. Okay. So does that make sense? Hume's argument there?
Wait, I don't understand. Why does your like experience have to be chaotic?
Well, imagine, so one problem is if we take Hume at his word, first starting with the bundle theory, and then qualifying or critically, pushing back the tendencies to misread the theater analogy. Remember, there is no stage, there is no theater. There's just this loosely coherent bundle of impressions or perceptions. They're not chaotically organized. My memory puts these things in a particular pattern, right? Which allows me to make sense of the world. And furthermore, the things that make up this bundle in my own life are mine. I don't ever confuse my experience with yours. Yet if there's no stage, so to speak, if there's no principle of binding, like if there's no thing we can point to, even if it's not really a thing that brings together all of the objects of the bundle, well then what would prevent me from confusing my experience from yours? Right? How is it that I have my experience and it's always mine and it's quite special and distinct from anything you guys are aware of, although we can communicate with each other about how we experience the world on more or less shared terms, but we never mistake each other for each other, right? Or for ourselves, I mean. Does that make sense? So, I mean, you might challenge Kant on this, but his point is the mistake Hume was making is to look for the I, or to look for the self as one looks for any object. And Kant is suggesting that maybe the problem is that it's not an object at all. It's a condition for the possibility of objects. And he'll do the same thing, as we'll see when we come back to Hume, in critical response to Hume's argument against cause and effect relationships. And so this is a product of Kant's so-called transcendental idealism, which says that we never have access to things in themselves as they exist out there in the world independently of our thought and experience. In fact, the very structures that make up our thought and experience organize the world for us. And one of those structures that is necessary for the very perdurance and constitution of our experience is the self. It's the I. And yet, because it's not a thing we can point to, it's not an object, we can't argue towards it in a direct way. We have to argue towards it through this kind of transcendental move where we're saying, well, look, if there is no self, like Hume suggests, then the nature of our experience would be dramatically different than it is. But it doesn't seem to be. Thus, there has to be some more or less consistent I, or self. And so before we go on to the group, I wanted to lead just a few minutes of guided meditation. And this might help some of your confusion, Mozu, to get a sense of where Kant is getting at. So if you all would bear with me and close your eyes and get into a bit of a relaxed state, I'll walk you through a moment of meditation. So try to get very still and relaxed. Okay, now slow down your breathing and allow each inhalation and exhalation to complete itself. And just do that very slowly without forcing it. And now bring your awareness to your breath. Focus on the breath as it moves through your passages into your belly. And then now turns out through exhalation. So now, as you are aware of your breath, notice that you are noticing it. if you notice your breath, then there is your breath and there's you that notices it. Yet your breath changes. Each breath is different from the last. But the you that notices this change does not change. So once again, notice your breath. Be aware that you're aware of it. Be aware of its change. And notice that you who notice are not changing. Now bring your attention to some bodily sensation, some feeling. Perhaps you have a minor strain in your back or an itch on your arm, some bodily sensation. So bring your attention to that. Now notice that you are noticing it. Now notice that that sensation has changed. Perhaps the pain has moved. Perhaps it's momentarily dissipated. Perhaps the itch has gone. But notice that you who are observing this isn't changing. There is the sensation, and then there is you that notices the sensation. Now, bring your attention to any thought. It could be a memory, it could be a problem, it could be a worry, it could be a happy anticipation. And stay with that thought for just a moment. So now notice that you are observing this thought. And be aware that this thought doesn't stay in place. It's perhaps changing, maybe giving rise to a new thought. So there's the thought, and then there's you who notices it. If there is the thought, and then there is you who notices it, that means that the you can't be identical with that thought. Okay, so come back to us now. So what are you guys reflecting on that experience, that meditation experience, which is a version of mindfulness, and it's trying to bring you into attunement with what practitioners identify as the observing mind, right? So the observing mind is that which does the observing, and it observes thoughts, perceptions, sensations, memories. But it itself remains self-same. It continues, it endures as all of these objects themselves alter, right? So that's kind of what Kant has in mind here as the transcendental I, which has to be in place for any empirical I. And the empirical I or self becomes wrapped up or reduced to or identified with any particular thought you have at a given moment, right? Any particular experience or sensation. But those thoughts and experiences and sensations are always given to transform. Yet the observing remains identical. And so sometimes the metaphor is given of a blue sky, right? So imagine a blue sky, and there are clouds that move across it, various birds that fly, yet the sky remains untouched. The sky remains the neutral and enduring background that sustains all of this mutability. Right? So that is the transcendental I, right? Which is not an object that you can pin down, but it's one that is constantly moving. And so we sometimes try to find the self, as we have been over the course of the past few weeks, like you're following someone almost. You're trying to catch them without them noticing you. You quickly move around the corner, right? Hoping to catch them. But every time you do, the person is gone. They flitter away. They remain out of reach, right? So that's what the self is. It's a kind of fool's errand, as it were, to look for it as something that we can find and pinpoint, because it's that which is always behind. It's withdrawing and disappearing, but still remaining. Those efforts to locate ourselves or whatever it is that we're engaged with or thinking about or caring about in the world. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so let's go ahead with our presenters then. So we've got about 20 minutes or so left. I'm sorry I didn't mean to take up so much time, but we've had a pretty good conversation. So I like to allow the class discussions to go where they will sometimes. So you guys are free then to take it away.
It's muted. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to start off this part of the presentation, just reviewing some of Hume's stuff. And I wanted to start with a YouTube video. I sent it to you, Mr. Harmon. I wonder if it'd be okay to watch it. It's really short.
Oh, let me see.
It's a TED Talk. Not a TED Talk. It's more like a little visual. And hopefully this will segue nicely into Abraham and Robin's material on Buddhism.
Oh, so you emailed it to me?
Oh, no, I sent it to you through direct message on Zoom.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Let me see. Okay, I found it. So you just wanted me to play the video?
Yeah, I think it'd be better if we did it on your side because you're hosting the meeting.
Yeah, okay. So let me share the screen. I have it pulled up.
We live in a three-dimensional world where everything has length, width, and height. But what if our world were two-dimensional? We would be squashed down to occupy a single plane of existence, geometrically speaking, of course. And what would that world look and feel like? This is the premise of Edwin Abbott's 1884 novella, Flatland. Flatland is a fun mathematical thought experiment that follows the trials and tribulations of a square exposed to the third dimension. But what is a dimension anyway? For our purposes, a dimension is a direction, which we can picture as a line. For our direction to be a dimension, it has to be at right angles to all other dimensions. So a one-dimensional space is just a line. A two-dimensional space is defined by two perpendicular lines, which describe a flat plane, like a piece of paper. And a three-dimensional space adds a third perpendicular line, which gives us height and the world we're familiar with. So what about 4 dimensions, and 5, and 11? Where do we put these new perpendicular lines? This is where Flatland can help us. Let's look at our square protagonist's world. Flatland is populated by geometric shapes ranging from isosceles triangles to equilateral triangles to squares, pentagons, hexagons, all the way up to circles. These shapes are all scurrying around a flat world, living their flat lives. They have a single eye on the front of their faces, and let's see what the world looks like from their perspective. What they see is essentially one dimension, a line. But in Abbott's Flatland, closer objects are brighter, and that's how they see depth. So a triangle looks different from a square, looks different from a circle, and so on. Their brains cannot comprehend the third dimension. In fact, they vehemently deny its existence because it's simply not part of their world or experience. But all they need, as it turns out, is a little boost. One day, a sphere shows up in Flatland to visit our square hero. Here's what it looks like when the sphere passes through Flatland from the square's perspective. And this blows his little square mind. Then, the sphere lifts the square into the third dimension, the height direction where no Flatlander has gone before, and shows him his world. From up here, the square can see everything. The shapes of buildings, all the precious gems hidden in the earth, and even the insides of his friends, which is probably pretty awkward. Once the hapless square comes to terms with the third dimension, he begs his host to help him visit the fourth and higher dimensions. But the sphere bristles at the mere suggestion of dimensions higher than 3 and exiles the square back to Flatland. Now, the sphere's indignation is understandable. The fourth dimension is very difficult to reconcile with our experience of the world. Short of being lifted into the fourth dimension by a visiting hypercube, we can't experience it. But we can get close. You'll recall that when the sphere first visited the second dimension, he looked like a series of circles that started as a point when he touched Flatland, grew bigger until he was halfway through, and then shrank smaller again. We can think of this visit as a series of 2D cross-sections of a 3D object. Well, we can do the same thing in the third dimension with a 4-dimensional object. Let's say that a hypersphere is the 4D equivalent of a 3D sphere. When the 4D object passes through the third dimension, it'll look something like this. Let's look at one more way of representing a 4-dimensional object. Let's say we have a point, a 0-dimensional shape. Now we extend it out 1 inch, and we have a 1-dimensional line segment. Extend the whole line segment by 1 inch, and we get a 2D square. Take the whole square and extend it out 1 inch, and we get a 3D cube. You can see where we're going with this. Take the whole cube and extend it out 1 inch, this time perpendicular to all 3 existing directions, and we get a 4D hypercube, also called a tesseract. For all we know, there could be 4-dimensional life forms somewhere out there, occasionally poking their heads into our bustling 3D world and wondering what all the fuss is about. In fact, there could be whole other 4-dimensional worlds beyond our detection, hidden from us forever by the nature of our perception. Doesn't that blow your little spherical mind?
You can end it there. Yeah. All right. So I thought that video was super useful to visualize the stuff that Hume went over in the material for this week. In a lot of the, what's it called, reading, he's talking about like the difference between like a unified object and like a series of objects. And I think that this video is a really interesting way to view it, because a lot of Hume's, like the way that Hume defines identity is through perception, right? And so if we're like the Flatlanders, I don't know, it gives some like perspective towards the way that we view identity here, because he talks about memory and other things, and really what Hume's trying to describe, and I think this segues nicely into the rest of the reading for this week, is that identity is trying to like what Mr. Harmon said earlier, is like trying to describe something that's a physical object that isn't really there. So I think that when we talk about Buddhism, as Abraham's about to talk about, it's trying to talk about something that we can't really like view, because like the Flatlanders view in like 1 dimension, and like we view in 2D, but we live in 3D, and things like rivers and rocks live in 3D. So when you talk about Buddhism, I don't know, like something like yourself, if you were to talk about yourself in like a 4th dimension, it'd be like yourself as like a child and as an old person, and also as like all the cheeseburgers and soda you've drank in your life. So yeah, I think that this gives a really interesting perspective on like the interconnectedness of everything. Yeah, I think I'll pass it off to Abraham now.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, that was a really cool video. So getting into, I'm going to be talking about the heart of Prajnaparamita, or the heart of wisdom. And one of the first things I found whenever I was reading the version that was posted on Moodle is you could tell that there was a bunch of really basically like, so the Prajnaparamita it's a really important and popular sutra within Mahayana Buddhism. Sutra meaning a collection of aphorisms or concise observation that contains high truth. In the US, we have an aphorism, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, which is like a very small face value observation that has a lot of wisdom. But I could tell that this was like thousands of years of oral tradition, put into a very small space. And I think the translation from Sanskrit really doesn't do it very much justice. I found a different translation, also by Thich Nhat Hanh, that he did in 2014. So that's what I'm going to be going off of. But yeah, this text is called like the most frequently used and recited text in the entire canon of Mahayana Buddhist tradition. But basically the sutra begins with Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion. And a bodhisattva is anyone who's generated bodhicitta. That can't be the right pronunciation, but which is a spontaneous wish and compassionate mind to attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. So this guy is meditating deeply on what's called perfection of wisdom, or another translation is the insight that brings us to the other shore. And in doing this, he found that all 5 of the skandhas, or the aggregates of human existence, are empty. And here, the perfection of wisdom is translated from the Sanskrit word pranjna paramita, which is the concept of a perfected way of seeing the nature of reality. And the 5 skandhas are form, feeling, volitions, perception, and consciousness, or rupa, vedana, sankara, samjna, and vijnana. And so he found that all 5 of the skandhas are empty, and the term emptiness is a translation of the concept of shunyata, which is the tenet of like all things are empty of intrinsic existence and nature. And that right there was specifically one of my challenges in reading this, because I feel like the word emptiness is like, there needs to be a whole paragraph where they use the word emptiness to really understand this text. But it continues with, the body itself is emptiness, and emptiness itself is the body. This body is not other than emptiness, and emptiness is not other than the body. And to me, and then it goes on to say that the same is true of feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. And then it goes on, all phenomena break the mark of, or bear the mark of emptiness. Their true nature is the nature of no birth, no death, no being, no non-being, no defilement, no purity, no increasing, no decreasing. And to me, this is like a very spiritual expression of like the law of conservation of energy, as in like with no birth and no death. The way that I interpreted that is like, there's dirt in the ground and there's an apple tree that grows from it. And when your mother was pregnant, she was eating apples off of this tree that came from the dirt. And then that's what created the physical manifestation of you. So you weren't really born from your mother, you were just born from everything. And so therefore you were never really born. And whenever you return to the dirt, you never really died. It just changes energy forms. But continuing on, it concludes with the writing that the 12 links of interdependent arising and their extinction are also not separate self-entities. Whoever can see this no longer needs anything to attain. Bodhisattvas who practice the insight that brings us to the other shore see no more obstacles in their mind. And because there are no more obstacles in their mind, they can overcome all fear, destroy all wrong perceptions, and realize perfect nirvana. All Buddhas in the past, present, and future practicing the insight that brings us to the other shore are capable of attaining authentic and perfect enlightenment. And then the sutra ends with a mantra that's kind of sums that up, which is Gate Gate Peragate Parasamgate Bodhisva. And that translates to, oh, I didn't put the translation in there, but translates to something. But that expresses the enlightenment of a Buddha as an unfolding process rather than a steady state, as in it's not saying I'm enlightened or I'm not enlightened. It's vocalizing and expressing the position of one who may not have arrived, but who may be on the way, and the destination not to be an end, but the journey itself. And that's basically what that says. But yeah. Sorry, I didn't leave much time for Robin to continue, but I'll stop there.
Robin, you don't have too much time, but you have a few minutes, and we can continue this next week as we feel. So it's not like you should feel rushed or anything. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I really like. So I think do you say his name Thich Nhat? Is that how you pronounce his name?
I mean, I think it's Thich Nhat Hanh.
Okay, that's what I figured. This reading was like really interesting because he's looking at a piece of paper and describing how it all started with the cloud, and then went into depth of how it's like, if you didn't have the cloud, you wouldn't have the sun. If you didn't have the sun, you wouldn't have like the dirt, and like if you didn't have like wood, you wouldn't have a logger and stuff like that. And it was like really fascinating. And it's like he's trying to open our eyes to look more into depth on things, and I think that's really, really cool. Like we're all created by our parents, and if like we didn't have the sun, we wouldn't be here because we also grow off of the sun. And it like really astonishes me that he looks at something and describes how and where it came to be, because it's like I don't just look at a pencil and be like, oh, this is where it came from, this is how it started, you know. We as well are like made out of everything. Like we're made out of not just our parents, we're made out of the sun, clouds, dirt, like everything. So like we're part of the earth in a way. And let's see, that's pretty much my argument. But like this reading just like opened up my eyes that I need to look into something more, look into people more, and like understand more. And that's pretty much my point of view, because I don't want to take longer, but yeah, that's my argument.
Cool. So I'm glad you drew some value from the reading and found it powerful. So we have like a moment or so. What are your thoughts, others, on the Thich Nhat Hanh reading in particular, this idea of interbeing? What do you guys think about that?
It's kind of the basics for scientific origin.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in our current understanding of the origins of the universe, all of the elements were kind of created from each other. So by helium and hydrogen combining and stars burning, then the heavier elements were produced, and then other elements were produced from those through chemical reactions. And so in the basis of it, a lot of scientists will say with a straight face, like, we're stardust.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're made of all of the things that came from we were at one time one point in space, and so we're all kind of connected in that unifying way. So I've always kind of thought that that was a wonderfully magical part of science.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, at one point we were compressed to an object the size of like a golf ball or something that is expanding to this day, and here we are, here we find ourselves, right? Yeah, so we're pretty much out of time. We will continue this just a little bit, but I want to leave you with this thought to perhaps illuminate how the insight we're drawing from the Buddhist tradition is concretely impactful in living your life. So, and this connects to the Kant thing and the meditation practice we worked through. But every thought that you have that arises that might be disturbing or a constant source of distress or anxiety is at the very same time an invitation to consider the emptiness of that thought. So you can let it go, right? And if you fixate on your identity in some problematic sense, if you're not who you think you should be, if you have failed in some way, if you hate yourself because of these recurrent ideas, well, Kant's insight too is to say, you are not any of those ideas. You don't have to be any of those things. You are so much more than that. Your very being and presence and becoming in the world is precisely inexhaustible, right? So yeah, just, you know, hold on to that, and we'll continue thinking through that just a little bit more, and then we'll transition to a discussion of Hegel again through John Russon's helpful essay, a chapter from his book. So I'll see you guys on Tuesday, and thanks for another great discussion, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. And thanks so much for the presenters. Let's give them a round of applause. Really nice job, guys. So I'll see you next week, and let me know if you have any questions about anything.
Great.
Thank you.
Right,
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Yeah, take care.